Welcome to the Wheats on Your Mind podcast. My name is Aaron Harries. Wheats on Your Mind is brought to you by the Kansas Wheat Commission and Kansas Association of Wheat Growers. On this episode of the podcast, we are visiting with Kelsey Andersen Onofre with Kansas State University. Dr. Onofre is an assistant professor in the Department of Plant Pathology at Kansas State University and an extension specialist. She is originally from New Jersey, obtained her bachelor's in biology from Lafayette College, master's in plant pathology from The Ohio State University, and PhD in plant pathology from the University of Florida. At Ohio State, her research focused on epidemiology and management of Fusarium head blight of wheat. So, Kelsey, glad to have you on the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me here, Aaron.
It's a good time of year. We're kind of in between things, in between harvests and getting ready for planting season. It doesn't seem like it should be that far away. Kelsey, let's start off by taking a look back at the 2024 wheat crop. There wasn't a lot of disease pressure in the harvest in 2023 because the drought was so bad. I mean, nothing wanted to grow. Diseases, sure. It just wasn't that big of a deal. So this year, obviously, it was a bit bigger of a game in 2024. So, I think we have a pretty good appreciation for the economic impact that these diseases can have on a Kansas wheat crop, and that's something that you track. And so, looking back now on this year's wheat crop, give us some of the highlights or lowlights of where the disease pressure was and how big of an impact it did have.
Sure. Yeah, I like that you said low lights because, I know the disease situation is never something we want to see on Kansas farms. But I think this was a year where we did have a few that stood out as more problematic. Probably the biggest one that was patchy but still important was stripe rust. So we had stripe rust, leaf rust, and stem rust active in the state. That kind of trifecta of rust, so that's bad news for our wheat crop. But the one that got started the most early and probably was the most destructive was stripe rust. And at K-State, we start actually watching stripe rust in the fall. It doesn't survive in Kansas, gets killed off during the winter, and it needs to overwinter or survive in regions that are warm in the winter, like Texas and Mexico. And so we start looking at conditions in Mexico and Texas pretty early, and this year was mild in Texas, kind of those perfect conditions for stripe rust to survive. And we started to see it pretty early in that northern panhandle of Texas in January. I think somebody commented that it was the earliest and most severe they'd seen stripe rust. So that always tips us off that it could be a bad year. We've got a lot of spores coming up from our neighbors there in the south. And we did see that play out in Oklahoma first. This is a good one because we can watch it coming. So we saw pretty high levels in parts of Oklahoma in February, and that makes us nervous. And we found the disease for the first time in Kansas in April. April 9th, I think, was our first detection. And through the weeks after that April 9th detection, of course, we're tracking. We always like to get reports of stripe rust. If somebody else sees it, we really like to receive those reports so we can map it out and let producers know in real time what we're seeing. But things were pretty quiet. We had a few reports, but the levels were pretty low through April. But as you remember, we got some showers, right, in that early May period. They were spotty, right? So we had winners and losers in terms of getting that May moisture. If you got that moisture, you probably had better yields, but you also had higher rust. So we saw pretty dramatic differences in rust pressure throughout the state. There were cases where, 10 miles apart, if you had some of those showers, that wet canopy, you had very severe rust. You go 10 miles down the road and we had almost nothing, right? So it was a very spotty year just in general for yields, and that translated into rust pressure too. Late in the season, we had leaf rust kick off. So we found it first in that south central part of the state. It was probably did cause some yield damage in some of those most southern counties, but probably was a little later in other parts of Kansas to really have any yield penalty. And the other rust we've been tracking is that stem rust. So we did find stem rust earlier than we would like and a little more severe than we would like on some of our susceptible varieties. Most of our varieties are resistant. Some are susceptible. So that's one that we also were keeping an eye on this year.
Yeah, stem rust is not one that's really in the front of people's minds very often. I mean, historically and globally, it's one of the most damaging pests that there is. So there are varieties that are susceptible out there. It just goes to the importance of genetic selection for resistance to that. Are the treatment options, the fungicides that work for stripe and leaf rust, effective also on stem rust?
That's a great point, right? Resistance is the absolute best tool, and we're lucky we do have a lot of very good resistance. There's kind of the varieties that have resistance and those that are very susceptible out there right now. So that's an important thing to keep an eye on. The thing we want to be very cautious about with stem rust is that it usually comes on late. So of our 3 rusts, stem rust likes the hottest weather. So we typically see it later in the season. And by that time, it's very hard to mobilize for a fungicide application. So it causes damage fast. Sometimes we're even past our label restrictions for our fungicides, and we probably can't typically catch it in time. So it's one that, we can manage with fungicides under certain situations, but it's very easy to miss that fungicide application, and the yield loss it's the most severe of the rusts, right? It melts your stems. It really takes down a plant. So it's one we're definitely keeping an eye on.
I sensed during the wheat tour that maybe leaf rust, the pressure was higher than it's been in previous years. It's been a while since I've walked out of a field and had orange on my blue jeans. Is that correct? There was a little bit more leaf rust pressure this year?
Yeah, it came in later than stripe rust. So stripe rust it's usually the first big story, right? Because it likes the cooler weather. It comes in first. But leaf rust definitely took off. Again, in that south central part of the state, it really took off. And then we did have pockets, in the more northern tier of states. According to some of our data, probably one of the worst leaf rust outbreaks we've had, at least in the last 4 years. That's not saying much. We've had a couple big drought years, but again, you're right that it did come on late, and it was more severe than it's been in recent years.
Control options for rust are genetic resistance and fungicides. It was a tough year for inputs. The wheat prices weren't necessarily as high as we would like them to be, and so that was a tough decision depending on how drought situation was in your area, whether you were going to use fungicides. Were fungicides used widely this year?
That's a good question. And I don't have the best data on that. So I have, what we've heard. We'll be able to look back at some USDA data to know for sure, but that takes a little bit of time. But generally what I've heard is that it was 50-50 and it came in. So when we did have those fungicide applications, they were a little bit on the late side because that stripe rust came on late. Just from some of the feedback that I've heard, there were some of those, early sprayers that were probably going to spray no matter what, or, kind of heeded the warnings coming out of Oklahoma. And then there was a whole wave of kind of late applications in flowering when we really had stripe rust and leaf rust taking off that were trying to get that on before the 30-day harvest restriction. So, yeah, that's a good question. Do I know the percent? What do you think, Aaron? What have you been hearing?
Just by perception, what I've heard, I would think maybe it was not used as widely as maybe in some other years. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see the data when it comes out later, how that was used. Well, moving on to the rots, the foot rots and the root rots. What happened this year?
Yeah, so this was one that caught us off guard a little bit. So every year we see a little bit of root and foot rot, but this year we saw more than we would have expected, especially in south central Kansas and central Kansas. And, the key here is I think it was confused with drought stress or freeze injuries. Typically when you're seeing foot rots or root rots, Fusarium foot rot, or sometimes we call it dryland foot rot, we're actually seeing completely dead tillers. And it happens around heading, happens as we're getting into those later stages of development. You just start to notice white tillers in the field, sometimes in patches, and sometimes it'll be a pretty big area. And, if you're just looking at the field, you probably think it's drought stress or heat stress. But when you actually go in and pull those plants, the first thing you'll notice is the root system is pretty bad, right? So they've got very minimal roots. The roots are brown and discolored. And then if you peel back the leaf sheath of the lower stem, you'll actually see this chocolate brown or sometimes even pink discoloration. And that lets you know it's Fusarium foot rot, which is what we saw a lot of this year. So actually pulling those stems, peeling back that leaf sheath will show you that you actually have a foot rot or a root rot problem. There's a couple others, right? So we have take all, which is, has a slightly different set of environmental characteristics, but that, you can do the same thing, right? You'll pull up the plants and they'll pull out pretty easily because you're missing a good amount of your root system. And you'll peel back that leaf sheath and then you'll see a more black discoloration. So you might say your wheat's wearing brown socks or black socks. I think that's something Bob Bowden or Eric DeWolf would say in plot tours, but that's a good way to remember.
It's a good way to distinguish them, yeah.
Right, if you've got Fusarium root rot or take all. There's a couple others, but Fusarium root rot was the one that we saw most frequently this year.
And you distinguished those from freeze. Freeze is probably not going to kill the whole tiller. Is that how you look at it?
Usually we see, with freeze damage, you can see whole tiller death. Typically you'll see more of a uniform death of either the top part of the head or you'll see complete plant death. This is very characteristic because you'll just have some of your late tillers that start to die off right around that flowering period. But the best thing to do is go and, pull some plants and really double check your lower stem and your crown. That's the best way to distinguish them.
And are seed treatments the option for those?
Seed treatments help, but they don't prevent it. The good thing about seed treatments, they can help you get your stand established. They prevent those same pathogens from causing damping off or just complete plant seedling death early in the season. But they last once you plant. So you treat your seed, you plant your seed, that seed treatment becomes active, and it really only lasts in the plant 30 to 45 days. So occasionally with some of these diseases, we get later infections and they don't protect against those later infections. So most of the seed treatments are labeled as suppressing these diseases and not helping. So seed treatments is one tool in the box. Usually we see these most severe in wheat after wheat rotations and in high organic matter fields. And then we just have the perfect storm of weather. So typically it's wet weather in the spring, or wet weather in the fall, followed by a period of drought in the spring. That's exactly what we had this year. We had wet weather in the fall for establishment and a period of drought in the spring. Once we got a little bit of moisture, your root system is badly affected and you're killing off those tillers essentially. So it's a perfect storm of weather conditions. We probably won't see it as severe going into future seasons.
Yeah, it was a strange weather pattern we had this year.
Yep.
So Fusarium head blight, it seems to me we escaped pretty much a bad year on scab.
I think we did. I think there were small examples where we did see just unfortunate rainfall around that flowering window, but just overall across the state, we had much lower risk this year. We did escape some of the worst epidemics that we've had in past years.
Interesting presentation you gave here recently about common bunt and stinking smut, the original great of the diseases, I guess, how that affects the crop this year.
For sure, yeah. So I got to talk a little bit about history there. We're here at Wheat U in Wichita here. Hopefully I didn't lose too many folks, but I love talking about pathogens, especially where they interact with history. And the funny thing about common bunt and stinking smut, right, is this is like one of the original diseases. So they didn't even know what diseases were. They didn't know what pathogens were. And somebody figured out that this black dust on the outside of their wheat seed was actually causing disease. They set up some experiments in Europe and they actually, were able to inoculate seedlings. And it's one of the first cases where we really realized microorganisms can cause diseases. We didn't even know they could cause diseases of people. And we figured out they caused diseases of
Would
plants,
this have been
right?
in the 1700s?
Yeah, this was in the 1700s.
Wow. Yeah.
Yep. So one of the original plant diseases that's described anywhere. So we're still dealing with it today, right? This is like the rusts. It's an ancient problem for wheat production. It's co-evolved with wheat, right? So rusts were around in the Roman Empire and so was, this common bunt issue. In Kansas too, it's interesting if you look back, in the early 1900s, it was one of the most important wheat diseases, right? We were getting 25% yield loss across the state because we didn't have any fungicide treatments and we didn't have any good varieties that were working for this disease. So yeah, it's an interesting one.
So common bunt still a problem today. And then There's dwarf bunt, TCK.
TCK.
Dwarf bunt, which we don't have here in Kansas, but in the past couple of years, there's been a little evolution, may not be the proper word, of these bunt types. And the way I like to describe it is there's been a dwarf bunt doppelganger out there, someone pretending to be dwarf bunt when it truly isn't, and that's caused some issues for us, especially in the export market. And you've been doing some research on that. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I like that dwarf bunt doppelganger. Yeah, that's exactly what we've got. We've got someone that looks like dwarf bunt out in Kansas and Oklahoma, but really isn't, from some of the research that we've been doing. And, it comes back to how they test for these two diseases, right? So common bunt or stinking smut is very common. Yeah, like the name suggests, it's everywhere wheat is. It's not regulated. Dwarf bunt, on the other hand, has very strict environmental requirements, right? So in some countries, it hasn't been detected, and it's something that needs long periods of snow cover. So it's really more of a northern U.S., Canada, and alpine region disease, right? So something that just shouldn't be here in Kansas, and we believe it's not. The way they test for it is they actually look at the spores under a microscope. They rinse lots of grain with water, and then they take samples and look at them under the microscope, and they actually, count the number of those spores that they're seeing. But the interesting thing is the dwarf bunt spores should have longer spikes on the outside of the spore. Like, we were just looking at spores, wouldn't be something you would do out in the wheat field, but we can do it in the lab. We can look under the microscope, right? The way the spores look are the way they're differentiating these species at those ports of export. The problem with that is, from some of the research we've shown, is that, again, we've got these common bunt isolates or strains of the pathogen here in this region that have those longer spikes on the outside of the spores, right? So they look like dwarf bunt, but they're not. They don't have to be managed like dwarf bunt from some of our research. They are, based on everything we've found so far, they are common bunt, but again, they can cause some of those issues, which you're very familiar with some of our export markets.
And they don't actually dwarf the plant, right?
They do not dwarf the plant the same way dwarf bunt would.
The good news is, irregardless of how you identify these, and you're doing some genetic research to try to come up with a test to distinguish between these, control options are available.
Right. So now we've done 3 years of seed treatment testing on these doppelganger isolates, and also the more common ones that we have here in Kansas. And the good news is the common seed treatments that we have, they work extremely well to control these diseases. We don't need any specialized fungicide. The interesting thing about dwarf bunt is you probably need a specialized fungicide called difenoconazole with that treatment. But we've shown that, any of the DMI triazole fungicides that are available in our common seed treatments, like Cruiser Max Vibrance cereals or Raxil Pro MD, work very well for bunt control. As long as we have pretty good coverage, even if we have high levels of infection, we can still get very good control with seed treatments. Before
we finish up with the viral diseases, let's put a plug in for the Fungicide Efficacy Guide that publishes from K-State.
Yeah, this is a great time to put some plugs in. So we have our K-State Seed Treatment Efficacy Guide that we publish every year, where we go through some of the key fungicide seed treatments that are commercially available and how well they work against our most common diseases. We also have a foliar fungicide efficacy guide that we update every year based on K-State data and also data from other states. So that goes through your fungicides that would be applied in the spring, and it rates them based on their, efficacy against certain diseases. So those are two really good companion guides as we're selecting our seed treatments in the fall, and then foliar fungicides in the spring.
Great. Those are great resources available to people. Okay, last but not least, viral diseases. We're talking about wheat streak mosaic virus, barley yellow dwarf, high plains virus, triticum mosaic virus. A little bit of an odd year for wheat streak and triticum mosaic virus, seeing those in some parts of the state. We normally don't see them.
Yeah, it was an odd year. So there was a couple things different about this year. One is that we saw wheat streak everywhere, right? So wheat streak classically has been a problem for our neighbors out west, right? For those most western tier of counties, they're no stranger to wheat streak. But, an interesting thing has emerged over the last few years, we've started to see, and we saw it again this year, more wheat streak in the central part of the state, the central corridor of the state. We're a little less prepared in the central corridor because we don't have a lot of varieties that have resistance, right? So most of our varieties are susceptible. You can check your variety resistance in our Kansas Wheat Variety Guide. It's something we're really keeping an eye on here. The other thing we saw was we actually had wheat streak mosaic in the northeast corner of the state.
Right.
We don't have a lot of wheat there.
Yeah.
But driving around to several fields, it seemed like a pretty big outbreak there. And that was confirmed also on that southeast corner of Nebraska. So that kind of same thing was going on across the state line. So we had good conditions this year. Conditions that were favorable for mites. We had some hail events last year that probably led to volunteer. But the other thing we're watching pretty closely is the increase of cover crops. Some of these cover crop species that either have some of the grasses that are hosts for the curl mites in the species mix, or that might have volunteer kind of hidden within the volunteer wheat, hidden in the cover crop species. So it's interesting. You know, there's always a different story of exactly what happened when we come out to a field visit with bad wheat streak or an area. But those are the themes that are emerging, right? We had hail, we had a lot of volunteer, maybe came up later than we thought it would, good conditions for the mites, and then some cases where those cover crops were probably causing us some trouble.
And Triticum mosaic virus a lot of times is just co-present with wheat streak mosaic virus. Sometimes we'll just shorten it to TRIM-V. It's starting to emerge as a bigger problem, isn't it?
Yeah. So again, we have this suite of viruses, right? It's not just wheat streak, and we're starting to really refer to them as the complex, right? Because it's hard to just tease out the management to one or the other. So if we're thinking about wheat streak complex, we've got wheat streak mosaic virus in that mix, but we also have Triticum mosaic virus, like you're mentioning, or TRIM-V. And from some of the recent surveys from K-State and just reports out of our diagnostic clinic, it seems like more TRIM-V is starting to emerge in the central corridor of the state. So something that we'd seen in western Kansas before, usually in pockets, we see those co-infections, but now we're seeing more TRIM-V in central Kansas. And we're also finding more scenarios where we might have single infections of Triticum mosaic, so not in association with wheat streak at all. And this is different, and this is interesting. Some data I showed earlier has suggested that when you do have the co-infection of Triticum mosaic and wheat streak mosaic, you can have a higher yield loss level than if you just have one single infection alone, right? So when we do have a composite of viruses, we're typically seeing higher yield losses. I think the other piece of that is we don't have very good resistance for Triticum mosaic virus. So for wheat streak, we have a resistance gene called WSM2. It's got some limitations, but it can be pretty good. But when we're talking about Triticum mosaic virus, we have many, many fewer options. So I think that's also kind of catching us off guard a bit in the state. Yeah,
and as far as research goes, resistant genes to these viruses is not the easiest thing. It's an area of research that we commission funds through Farmer Checkoff Investment, and that is being worked on. In the meantime, we always focus on cultural control, right? That green bridge between harvesting and planting of the next year's wheat crop, we try to control that. It's a campaign we call Stop the Streak. Let's stop this disease. So we're entering that time of year where it's important to control our volunteer wheat. What are the parameters for that?
So yeah, this is the time. I think we say it a lot this time of year, but it can't be understated that controlling volunteer wheat within 2 weeks of planting is the most effective way to prevent wheat streak mosaic. Again, we have varieties. They have some limitations, but controlling your volunteer within that period of 2 weeks of planting is the best thing that we can do. 2 weeks within planting is ideal. Those curl mites, they'll typically die off under normal conditions within that time, so we can really get that clean area. And some ideal scenario, you'd also not have volunteer within a couple of miles, right? Because you want to have some spatial separation too between volunteer, not just within the field that you're planting into, right? If you've got a field maybe a quarter mile away that has bad volunteer at that time, that can still open you up to some infections.
Okay, so as we're heading into wheat planting season, do a quick review for us on best management practices to control disease. It starts with variety selection, genetic selection. What are the other things to be considered?
And I feel like this podcast is a little doom and gloom, right? Because we're talking about all the ways we can lose yield here in Kansas. But, definitely the first thing we can do is choose a variety that has at least the best resistance package to the diseases that we're most worried about, but also has the agronomic traits that we need. So we just released the Kansas Wheat Variety Guide. We go in and summarize disease data for all of these varieties and also agronomic information for all of these varieties every year. So that's a great place to start. We're choosing varieties based on disease. Some of it just depends on what we're willing to do, right? So if we're willing to go out and make a spring fungicide application, then we might be okay choosing a variety that's a little more susceptible to stripe rust, right? If it's something we don't want to budget for, we can go with one of the varieties that has good resistance to our leaf stem and stripe rust. That would be a good solution there, and you probably want to find something that's at least intermediate for head blight. If we're worried about viruses, of course, we have fewer options, but we do have some options that have some better resistance there. So again, variety selection we could talk about forever, and we do in our wheat plot tours, because that really kind of shapes how you're going to manage the crop later in the season in terms of disease. Always best management practice would be to start with clean seed that's treated with a seed treatment. So again, that takes care of a lot of our seed-borne diseases like the bunts and smuts that we managed, but also loose smut and some other issues like seedling blights that can cause stand and emergence issues. So we want to get a good clean stand by, of course, starting with clean seed and treated seed in the fall. So again, that's kind of what we're thinking about as we're moving into our planting season here.
Is there a difference between conventional till and no-till when you're making these types of management decisions?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we're going in, there's going to be a couple diseases we're going to think more carefully about if we're going into a no-till situation. So we'll probably have more issues with leaf spots. This was a question we just got in wheat use. So, tan spot, septoria, staganospora, those, brown leaf spots that work their way from the crop residue up to the upper canopy and can cause some issues for us. So, those diseases, maybe we have a few less options in terms of variety, although we do have some options. So it's good to check your variety resistance when going back into wheat stubble, for example. But fungicides can work very well to help prevent some of those residue-borne diseases. The other one we want to think about if we're going into no-till corn is scab. So that's our most risky situation when we're going back into no-till corn, because that pathogen just loves corn, causes gibberella ear rot, can be a big problem. So if we're going back into corn stalks, we want to choose the best variety we can for scab management.
Kelsey, that's some great advice. What's the best place to track down all these resources? Just go on the web?
The K-State bookstore has a lot of the resources that I mentioned, so that's probably a good place to go. Your local county extension office can get you any of these resources and also can link you up with the plant diagnostic lab too. If you do run into a disease or another issue in season, your county extension office is a great first place to stop.
Kelsey, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
My thanks to Dr. Kelsey Andersen Onofre for joining us on this episode of the Wheats on Your Mind podcast. If you have a topic you'd like us to cover in the future or have a question for one of our guests, please email us at kswheat@kswheat.com. I'm Aaron Harries. Thanks for listening.